So, Keith, let's go back to the beginning here. How did you start becoming fascinated with history? Where did this start for you?
So first of all, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming out. This is really surreal for me. But going back to the beginning, I, as a kid, big nerd from the beginning. My parents love to tell the story. My parents are here in the front. That I loved just about more than anything sitting on my bed reading atlases, reading encyclopedias. I loved data. I loved maps. I loved just kind of figuring out how humans had made the world into their own thing. And so that evolved as I got older. I was a Titanic kid. I got into all the nerdy hobbies. But when I got into, I think, middle school, I lived in a little town called Abilene, Texas. So I was growing up there, and the gifted and talented program there in the public school system was actually really great in that they partnered with the local Historic Preservation Society to get the kids, like me, to do historic research. And so one year, I forget, it must have been 7th grade, something like that, we were assigned the task of picking a historic building in Abilene and writing a paper about it. That would theoretically then be sent off to the state legislature to get the building designated a state landmark. Most kids picked more obvious landmarks, pretty old houses, theaters, things like that. I, being odd as I was, instead picked the town's trolley barn, because what I discovered was in like the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s, little Abilene with a couple tens of thousands of people actually had a functioning trolley system that ran the length of town. And in a, small, dusty plains town that was so car-centric when I was growing up there, it blew my mind to imagine that even it had a functioning transit system. And so it sent me down this rabbit hole of like, well, what was the city like then? What were people's behaviors like at the time? And it was really the first time that I comprehensively thought about how a city functioned. It wasn't just that there was a trolley barn, it was everything that used to go on there, the reason that it was built, and the purpose that it served. And so that paper really lit a spark in me that never went out. And from then on, it just evolved into seeking out academic studies of history, and then I went to grad school for urban planning. It just became my whole focus. I wanted to know how, why, when, what cities functioned for.
And I'm so glad you asked all those questions, right? But take us from how you moved from a person who was fascinated by history, which is something that clearly comes from you, to becoming, as we all know you, Keith York City. How did that happen?
So Keith York City, the name was born in 2012 when I actually started a Blogspot blog. I sincerely apologize to any of you who have found that website, which is still live online. It was a need for me because I moved to New York City in 2010, just needed to live here, just knew I needed to live here. But as often happens, my bachelor's degree in history was not a very lucrative academic background. So rather than work in history, which I loved and what I had gone to school for, instead I stumbled into a job at Ralph Lauren's corporate headquarters, and I ended up staying there for 10 years, and I was so incredibly bored. No offense, any of my Ralph Lauren people who are here, I see you in the back. But I needed some outlet for history. And at the time, this was early Instagram days. And I knew that normal Instagram fodder did not really mesh with my love for history. So it was kind of an odd clash between like my selfies, my meals, my vacations, and like every now and then me just blasting people in the face with history. And so I just, after starting the blog as kind of an outlet for that love of history, then with Instagram, I then created a second account borrowing the name Keith York City from the blog to then become Keith York City on Instagram. And it really was not meant to be anything that went far beyond my inner circle. It was really just for me to have an outlet, and that's how it began.
Well, surprise. It has become something. Right. But then COVID happened. And as is the case for many of us, it really was the game changer, and the chessboard really changed as a result of that. What happened?
Yeah, so in early 2020, I had already started a walking project. That's part of the story that's kind of left out, is I backing up a little bit. Essentially what happened was in 2019, I graduated with my master's degree in urban planning and found that now I had 2 degrees that I could not turn into a career. And so I was really kind of bummed out going through 2019, feeling like I was now highly overeducated and still working as an executive assistant at Ralph Lauren. And so we got to the end of the year, New Year's Eve 2019, going into 2020, I just needed some win for the year so that I could count 2019 as not just such a complete waste. And so I texted my then boyfriend, now partner, Clinton, who's somewhere. Oh, hi. Hi. That I was like, I have a crazy idea. I want to walk the length of Manhattan. And so on New Year's Eve 2019, Clinton and I walked from Marble Hill down to the Battery, and I felt so good after that that I decided arbitrarily I will walk every block of Manhattan. I didn't know how long this would take. I didn't know how many roads there were. I was just like, I'm going to do it. Then March came, the pandemic hit. I had walked like a good chunk of Midtown and a few chunks of like Harlem and downtown, but I kind of gave up on the project. And then adding to that with the terrors of the pandemic, and then I got furloughed from my job. I was just kind of staring down the barrel of like, I don't know what my life is now. I don't know what to do. Thankfully, Clinton and I took a chance on moving back to Manhattan. We'd stayed at my parents' house for a few weeks, kind of figuring out what was next, and we moved back to Manhattan in May of 2020, by which time I'd been furloughed. Didn't have anything to do or fill my days, and to simply not go insane, I picked the walking project back up. So in May, I started walking again. Now I had endless free time, and ended up finishing the walking project. In all, I counted, it was 977 miles that I walked for the project, and I finished it on December 29th of 2020, so just in time for the anniversary of that first walk that had spurred the whole thing. I'm not even sure I remember the original question, but...
You're doing fine. I just want to know what brand of shoes you wear.
It was, I'm not sponsored by any shoe company, but I will give a shout out to Merrill. Merrill did once send me a box of like 5 pairs of shoes, and they are hands down the best shoes I've worn for my walks. But anyway, it was completing that walking project. By the time I finished, I had fully lost my job, but the walking project on social media had gained enough of a following around the world, especially among people who were in lockdown and desperate to feel like they were on vacation or out doing something, that I'd gotten some press attention, which also brought offers of paid writing and lecturing gigs. And by the following spring, as kind of the terrors of COVID in the city began to ease up a little bit, people started asking through Instagram if I did walking tours, and I figured, why not? It could be fun. So I got my tour guide's license that April and gave my first tour that June, and I think yesterday I gave my 440th tour.
Now, the walking tour thing is fascinating to me because I've been a licensed tour guide since 2014. We shared that in common. And this is a city, as you all well know, you've all taken our tours, right? Of many, many, many companies that do walking tours. But yours are different. Yours are very special. Not only do they include your incredibly warm and wonderful personality, but how you approach the material is very different. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that material and what your philosophy is of giving a walking tour? What's different here?
So when I set out to give walking tours, I knew from the get-go I didn't want to give like your standard like Gray Line bus tour. It was not going to be just pointing out landmarks and saying, here it is. It needed to tell a story, and it also needed to help peel back the layers of the streetscape, because I found that the way I saw the city and its buildings and its layout was genuinely different from the way most people saw it. And if I could bring people into my eyeballs somehow, that I knew I had something. I knew I had a unique voice that I could bring to this, because there are a lot of tour guides, there are a lot of tour guide companies, a lot of very established museums that offer tours. I couldn't just jump into this and think that I, could be so bold as to offer my own version of what was already being offered everywhere else. And so I leaned heavily on my academic background. My urban planning master's finally came into use, and I decided to figure out tour routes and stories that went with them that told the whole story of the city while also enjoying the specific landmarks that we were visiting. And little by little, it kind of began to come together that I saw these stories live on the map. I'd look at Google Maps or Apple Maps, and I would see the stories as I understood them, and knew that I could bring people along for those stories if they were willing to. And over time, and another thing was I very much cloistered myself as a tour guide in those early days. I'm sorry if anybody's here from any of those tour guide companies. I didn't want to be influenced by another organization or someone else's voice in those early days. I very much wanted to figure out how to make Keith York City, Keith the historian, come through in these tours. And so I was very much like a lone wolf in those early days. And I think ultimately I feel very satisfied that I've tapped into a desire that a lot of people have to better understand the city in a way that doesn't feel cloying, it doesn't feel pandering, it doesn't feel condescending. I hope that comes through on my tours. I'm so thrilled that I get to share my enthusiasm for the city and the way that I see the city with so many people every day, and now I get to have an exponentially larger reach through this book, and I'm just really, really happy about that.
I've been so honored and lucky to have had you on The Gilded Gentleman 4 times. We've done 4 shows together, including a really fascinating show on the character, the Gilded Age Grande Dame Mamie Fish, and Keith represented the historical story here, and we also had the actor Ashley Atkinson, who portrays Mamie Fish on the HBO series, join us for the show as well. But when we did our very first show, we called it Chasing the Gold Up Manhattan. And what I loved about how you approached that is that as a historian, you took an overlay of your urban planning background. And as I like to say, you tell people how it all fits together. Can you just comment on that a little bit? Because I think, to me, we've certainly done that in the shows you've done, but that is the key to what you do that I think is so really extraordinary.
Yeah, I when it comes to the Gilded Age, it's a period that really captivates people, and for good reason. It was a very exciting period, but it was a very brief period. And so when I do my Gilded Age tours, and I'm sure many of you have been on my Gilded Age tours, thank you, but I often, it's surprising to people that I start my original Gilded Age tour way downtown at Washington Square, which is not a place people typically really associate with the heights of the Gilded Age. The big chateaus and mansions you typically think of when you talk about the Gilded Age are much further up the island, and many people assume that they were up on the Upper East Side. And so my goal in unpacking the story of the Gilded Age is understanding where these lives were lived and why. Because the timeline and the economy of the city really matter at the, most when you're trying to understand what the Gilded Age was. You've got to understand what was going on in the city in the lead up to the Gilded Age to understand why the kind of houses that these people were building, the lives they were living, were being played out where they were playing out. And so for that, again, I leaned heavily on my urban planning background, where I always say I try to help people understand the nuts and bolts of how this all came together. The Gilded Age, as an epoch, plays a big role in that, because it was a pivotal point when New York's whole essence was beginning to shift from more of like a provincial port town into a modern metropolis. And you can study these beautiful mansions and mourn the ones that were demolished all you want, but at the end of the day, if you don't understand what caused the Gilded Age, economically, socially, architecturally, I don't know what the adjective word is for war, but the effect that the Civil War and its aftermath had on the formation of a Gilded Age. And then also, I'm forgetting I often forget to tell this on tours too, there's a reason it's called a Gilded Age and not a Golden Age, because it really was a thin layer of success, like gilding, over a much less rarefied substance. So for the vast majority of New Yorkers, the Gilded Age was in fact what you learn about at the Tenement Museum or walking around the Lower East Side or Hell's Kitchen. The Gilded Age, the glitzy part of it that we love to look at in Newport and in the photos of Vanderbilt Row, really only existed for a tiny infinitesimal percentage of the population of New York. And that's, again, understanding that and why that was helps you understand why New York became the city that it's become.
So from your perspective as a historian, as a tour guide, and now as a writer, are there any misconceptions you find people have about the Gilded Age that you are constantly trying to correct?
One thing, and I kind of touch on this in the book in my Upper East Side chapter, is that I held off on doing an Upper East Side tour for years, despite the fact that that's where most of the really beautiful mansions that people think of today, when they think of the Gilded Age, that's where they go to see them. But I held off on doing a tour there because I didn't know how to tell that story, because I didn't agree that the Upper East Side was the center of the Gilded Age. And my book, the chapter for the Upper East Side, I was thrust into studying the Upper East Side in a more meaningful way to write that chapter for the book. And so I finally had to sit down and be like, all right, what is the Keith version of this story? And so my chapter's subheading is a coda for the Gilded Age. And in less fanciful terms, usually I tell people it's where the Gilded Age went to die. And so that's the story. It becomes the end of the arc that I start down at Washington Square, are these blocks going up to like 93rd Street, where many of the younger generations of these people who had risen up during the Gilded Age went to spend what they had inherited while often not still working in the businesses that had built the family's fortunes. And then they were hit with the triple whammy of World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II, leaving them often unable to live the kind of lives they'd previously lived. And so, to your question, the misconception is that the beautiful mansions in the Upper East Side are representative of the Gilded Age, when I'm of the opinion that a much more representative house is the brownstone down on 37th and Madison, which now serves as the gift shop for the Morgan Library. I think that tells a much more thorough story about the kind of jockeying for position that people were doing in the years leading up to and through the Gilded Age, and even into the 20th century, with J.P. Morgan Jr., who lived there, dying in 1940, 43, whatever year it was. Sorry, Jack. But that's a misconception I try to help guide people toward, because it can be very triggering on social media when people, other accounts that I won't name, love to post photos of big, beautiful mansions and say, this was demolished and replaced by this. But I want people to understand why these mansions were built and demolished, and I also want them to understand where it really happened. The heart of the Gilded Age played out not on the Upper East Side. It played out mostly on Murray Hill and what's now like the Rockefeller Center area on Fifth Avenue.
Now, I'm dying to get into your book, and we're just about to do that, but I must ask you the trademark question. If there was a character from the Gilded Age that you could sit down with today, just like we're all sitting here, who would it be, and what would you ask?
Oh, I wasn't ready for this question. It would change with the day, and probably it would have to change with what I was wearing. Because I'm like, I think I may have actually answered it this way on your podcast once, but I think just it's an obvious answer, but I'm so curious about what Caroline Astor was really like, the Mrs. Astor that Donna Murphy plays in the HBO show, that she's such an enigmatic woman, such a powerful force that is almost always talked about, because she gave virtually no interviews during her lifetime, allowed barely any photos or paintings to be taken of her. And so mostly what you learn about her is from the outside. And, you know, this is extraordinary for a woman that wielded so much power at the height of the Gilded Age, really kind of decided what was, you know, the bounds of fashionable society. And I would just love to know who she really was as a woman, you know, what kind of insecurities fueled this domineering presence that she had in the Gilded Age. You know, likely she was insecure over the fact that she had married down into the Astor family, who were, you know, 2 generations separated from being grubby beaver peddlers. So I would just, if I could have an honest conversation with her and she wouldn't throw me out, she's who I'd like to pick her brain.
Oh, and I just know Caroline Astor would love to talk to you too. I just know that. So you started your company in 2021. It certainly evolved, but now we're here in 2025, and my gosh, it has all evolved into a book. Can you talk a little bit about what that evolution was? How did that come to be? And what was the process of creating this book?
So I'm very grateful. I was contacted by a lovely person named Harriet. Harriet, are you here? Hi, Harriet. So good to see you. Harriet reached out to me. We had a nice coffee at the now defunct coffee shop at Fotografiska down on Park Avenue. And we discussed what my idea was for a book. And after that conversation, which was lovely, Harriet put me in contact with Kate Pollard at what was Hardy Grant, now Quadrille, the imprint that has produced my book. And from the beginning, you know, I'd had a lot of meetings and conversations with various publishers and agents over the years, none of which went anywhere, because I would often leave feeling kind of an ick factor that whoever I was sitting across from had an idea for what my book should be, and they were going to force that upon me. And it made me really uncomfortable that we were just talking in the back room that I had multiple meetings with very different and disconnected people, of people trying to pull out of me the New York version of Devil in the White City. And I just didn't know how many ways I could tell them that that's not my voice. That's not the kind of book that I can write. And so in conversation with Kate Pollard, my publishing executive at Quadrille, I knew instantly that Kate got what I was about, got my voice, and could guide me toward the book that it ultimately became. And so I'm very grateful to Kate and all the folks at Quadrille and Penguin Random House UK that have put the book out, that they've just done a phenomenal job of shepherding me, this very nervous first-time author, to the finish line with a book that really feels like me, which was not a given in the early days of my search for somebody who would publish my words. So I'm just couldn't be more satisfied with the way the book turned out. And
it's an extraordinary book, and I am told there are a few extra copies, so if someone has not bought one tonight, that can be remedied. So Keith, we talk a little bit about, take us through the book. What can we expect from it? It's not strictly a guidebook. It's more than a history. There's a lot that you've done in putting this together. What can we expect?
So the book is, if you haven't flipped through it yet, it's split up into 12 walks. The idea is that theoretically you could walk around. Many of these trace my actual tours. It's to let you see New York through my eyes. That's the idea. It's academic, it's cranial, but it's also my love letter to the city that I love so much. It's trying to bring you to a place where you see the city anew. Even if you've lived your entire life, I want you to be able to read the streetscape in a way that you otherwise wouldn't have before. And that's my goal. But the way the book is split up is generally from downtown to uptown, mostly neighborhood-based, except for 2 Gilded Age tours that cross neighborhood boundaries as we follow rich people up the island of the 19th century. But the rest of the tours are mostly, again, love letters to the city, but specifically love letters to these individual neighborhoods and their stories that go so far beyond just the buildings and the stores and the restaurants. It's how all of that came to be. That's my goal.
And are there any particular chapters in the book that you're really personally very, very proud of? You're proud of the whole thing, and you should be, but are there any particular parts?
I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I'm really proud of my Gilded Age chapters, just the whole concept of the way that I share the story of the Gilded Age with people beyond just the mansions. I'm really proud of my Gilded Age Origins chapter and its follow-up, Gilded Age Old Money, New Money. I think they will really help you understand New York at its core, and then the rest of the chapters are mostly neighborhood-based, so you'll understand those neighborhoods in a way. But the 2 Gilded Age chapters, and then kind of as a bonus prize, the Upper East Side chapter, I think really will help readers understand New York's entire kind of identity in a new way.
Now, I have to ask you the question that was my first question to Keith when we were talking on the phone after I got your copy of your book, is what were your discoveries? What did you come up with that you just was a surprise to you? Were there any secrets that you found? What happened in this process that surprised you? What did you discover?
I discovered a lot, especially in the neighborhoods I hadn't yet tapped into. So it was just a lot of chapters I could write just based on what I knew and stuff I'd already written in preparation for the tours or other writing projects. So there were the first chapter I mostly finished was the original Gilded Age chapter because I could tell that story in my sleep. But once I got through the chapters that the neighborhoods I was really familiar with, the stories I knew by heart, I got into the neighborhoods I didn't know so well, places like the Lower East Side and the East Village, which always felt overwhelming to me because they're so historically chock full of stories, but I have not been the kind of person to tell those stories. I just didn't know how to make my voice stand out in those neighborhoods, as well as the Upper East Side, Upper West Side. It took me a lot of time to get to know these neighborhoods in a way where I felt confident writing in a way that felt like me. But of the discoveries, the one that's for whatever reason coming to mind right now that I actually discovered actively while researching, and this is now part of my Upper East Side tour, is that Joseph Pulitzer, the famous yellow journalism publisher, was obsessed with the number 10. And so he used to live at, I think it was, I'm forgetting the numbers, but it was like 19 East 55th Street. 1 + 9 is 10, 5 + 5 is 10. But his house burned down. And so he decided to move to the Upper East Side. So at 73rd Street, what is now, I probably would make him roll in his grave, at what is now 11 East 73rd Street, he bought 5 townhouses, tore them down, and had Stanford White design for him a Venetian palazzo there. But the thing was, and I'm going to get the numbers wrong, so forgive my math, but the 5 houses he bought, if you added up their addresses, it created, adding them together created like a number that if you add those numbers together, it became 10, and then 73rd Street is 7 + 3 = 10. And so he chose that location as he had with his previous house, all because he was obsessed with the number 10. And so things like that, I'm just like, oh my, like it so humanized this person that I just kind of like threw away as like, oh, it's Pulitzer, move on. But he was a really quirky guy.
I didn't know that. We didn't know this, right?
Other than that, the things I loved about writing this book is that I got to actually dig down and confirm instances where like urban legends and kind of myths about New York are not actually true. And I'm really satisfied that I get to be the contrarian in my book. And
Can you share one?
Well, one of the most famous ones is the Hangman's Elm in Washington Square was almost definitely never used to hang anybody, and so I refer to the tree in the book as Elma, because that's what people in the neighborhood refer to it as instead. But it sat outside the bounds of the burial ground. It was not in the cemetery, and any hangings that did happen in what's now Washington Square, spoiler alert, there were hangings in Washington Square, but they were done on gallows, not on a tree. So that's a story that's just clung for so long to this poor 300-year-old tree in the park. And so I insist on calling her Elma instead.
So you can all park yourself under the tree now, and any tour guide that comes by, you can say, oh, no, that's not right. We know. We read. Now, Keith, what can you tell us about this little neighborhood where we're sitting right here tonight, where the Strand is? This is a fascinating area over quite a period of time. Yeah. But are there a couple of little things you can share with us about where we are right here tonight?
Yeah, so I'll breeze through the story as quickly as I can, but if you've been on a tour with me, you know nothing is quick when I'm telling a story. But we are on a really unique stretch of Broadway, which runs diagonal parallel to the Bowery just for 4 blocks, from 10th Street to 14th Street. The 2 streets run at an angle together. And the reason for that is, and some of this is wrapped up in mythology, so forgive me, I did go dig through this family's archives. So the land where we're sitting belonged in the colonial era into the early 19th century to the Brevoort family. If you're familiar, there's a couple apartment buildings over near Fifth Avenue called the Brevoort and the Brevoort East. They were an old Dutch family, owned an 86-acre farm stretching back from the Bowery, which is the original highway of Manhattan, back to about what's now Fifth Avenue, where the Minetta Brook used to run. And in the 1740s, a boy at the time, was born in this house named Henry Brevoort, grew up through the Revolution, fought in the Revolution, was a local major figure. By the time he was in his 80s and 90s, however, he was still living in his little Dutch farmhouse on the Bowery. And as the city grew up the island toward his farm, the story I've been told is that nobody wanted to be the one to go tell this octogenarian Revolutionary War hero to get out of his house to make way for Broadway, which was supposed to run right through his house. And so what happened was the city decided, largely out of deference to him, to bend Broadway at 10th Street. So just down where Grace Church is, Broadway bends for its first time in the entire run up from the harbor. If you stand on the front steps of Grace Church today, if you look south, you can see all the way to the harbor on a clear day and see the hills of Staten Island off in the distance. The reason it bends is to bypass Henry Brevoort's house. Then when he died in the 1840s, his children oversaw the splitting up of the farm, the sale of the lots, but they set aside the lot where the house used to be and only would sell it to something that they felt befit their longtime homestead. That tenant was eventually Grace Church, which had been founded downtown in 1808 and was looking to move uptown in the 1840s. And so the Brevoorts had one request for Grace Church. If they were going to get that land and build a church there, the church had to hire their nephew to design the church for them. And that nephew was a 23-year-old guy who'd gone to school for engineering, never built anything beyond a fountain and a piece of a reservoir. But his name was James Renwick Jr.
He did okay.
He did okay.
Yeah, but then what did he do?
The Grace Church was such a success that less than 10 years later, Renwick was given the commission for St. Patrick's Cathedral, as well as the Smithsonian Castle down in Washington, D.C. But in the end, where we're sitting here on Broadway is a remnant of that one family having some sway because they were an illustrious old Dutch family. They're also the reason why 11th Street doesn't cut all the way through, why Grace Church has such a large churchyard. This is what I got to look at in the Center for Brooklyn History out in Brooklyn, was they have the Brevoort family papers, and they sent letters to the city council just telling them, we have 10th Street, we have 12th Street, nobody needs 11th Street. So that block between Broadway and the Bowery doesn't run through because of them. And then the last thing I'll say is, this is another favorite little tidbit, is that because Broadway bends and runs parallel to the Bowery for those 4 blocks, it only comes into union with the Bowery up at 14th Street. And so that intersection came to be known as Union Place because it was the union of Broadway and the Bowery. And so Union Square is called Union Square not because of the Civil War Union or labor unions, but the name long predates either of those, and it's named simply because it was a traffic interchange because of the Brevoorts.
Isn't that a great fact? You can share at your next cocktail party. Everyone is going to be so impressed by that. Now, Keith, I would love it, and I'm sure all of our friends here would love it too, if you would read a section of the book.
Sure. So I'm just going to read a brief passage from walk number 7, which is my second Gilded Age chapter, from Murray Hill to Central Park. And this is just the introduction. The great divide between old money and new money in Gilded Age New York was a phenomenon which is too often distilled into a somewhat petty dichotomy, pitting Mrs. Astor's old guard against the likes of Mrs. Vanderbilt. The truth of the matter is both simpler and more consequential. Prior to the American Civil War, the prerequisites for joining society's inner circle were incredibly strict. A person's lineage mattered far more than their bank accounts. Respectability was earned over generations and could not be purchased. It is important, too, to take into account the timeline of New York's growth and wartime history. Neighborhoods like Washington Square, Astor Place, and even Gramercy Park were developed in the 1830s and 1840s, mere decades after the American Revolution. New Yorkers of not terribly advanced age during this period would have grown up during the war and almost certainly would have seen relatives fight or die in the name of American independence. Since most Loyalist families fled New York during the Revolution, those that remained had often risked quite literally everything in support of the patriotic cause. They are likely to have attended George Washington's 1789 inauguration on Wall Street or known Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr before their fateful 1804 duel. In short, America's founding and inherent fragility was not lost on New York's leading families in the first half of the 19th century. With this in mind, it begins to make sense that New York's old guard, the old money folks of the impending Gilded Age, lived lives still informed by the stoicism of the nation's Puritan and stolid Dutch founders. There was an understanding that wealth and social prominence came with certain responsibilities, that the egalitarianism envisioned for this new nation must be upheld through example. At a time when the United States was still largely looking inward to determine its future, New Yorkers erred on the side of conservatism of dress, carriage, and comportment. This played out in virtually every aspect of early 19th century life, but most notably in architecture, which remained uniformly mundane. Quote, Gotham was, architecturally speaking, a monotonous grid of virtually identical brownstone row houses, with divergence frowned upon, if not outright forbidden. Everything changed during the American Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 65. Northern urban centers like New York rapidly industrialized to feed the national war machine, giving rise to an entirely new generation of wealthy families whose fortunes came from manufacturing, banking, and railroads. These nouveaux riches lacked the sense of conservative responsibility so long fostered by the old guard and were instead eager to flaunt their riches with as much glitz as possible. Thus began the usurpation of New York's former leading class, with its dowdy restraint, sterling pedigrees, and quiet adherence to tradition. These new money folks, led by the likes of Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Huntington, spent lavishly on the fastest horses, the finest French fashions, and the largest, gaudiest mansions that money could buy. In diamonds, mahogany, and limestone, these new money titans redefined what it meant to be rich in America, and in so doing, they helped usher in New York's Gilded Age. But their ostentation not only flew in the face of social tradition, it raised the question of what sort of nation the United States ought to become. Would it still attempt to uphold some notion of egalitarianism, or would the nation's grand experiment devolve into a sort of capitalistic monarchy, one in which people pay homage to millionaires and industrial masters in place of the sort of hereditary monarchy it had so recently fought to cast off? This is the essence of the conflict between old money and new money, a divide which would come to define the era forever.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Now, I just have a couple of more questions before we open up the floor to all of you. So one of the things that really strikes me about Walking New York is it's a book very much for us New Yorkers here, but also people that are visiting or have never been here to New York. And for people that are just coming here for the first time or haven't been here very much, my gosh, the city can be so overwhelming. Where do you recommend people start to, as we say, peel back the layers of the onion? Where do you think someone who's never been here should start?
That was a really tough question. So one thing, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of my goals with this book was that, yes, it's a book you can carry around. One of my goals in the design of the book's cover was that you, as a New Yorker, not feel embarrassed walking around with it. I don't want you to feel like a schmuck walking through Times Square. I don't want you to become a target for any Elmos. But so it looks, I hope, just like any old book. It looks like you're reading a novel. But the other side of that is that I'm hoping that my writing is clear enough and my directions are clear enough in the book that even if someone never visits New York, they just have a fascination with the city, that they can follow along on Google Street View if they want to. My dad confirmed that he was able to follow along quite well in testing that out for me. I appreciate that, Dad. But in order, if people are visiting for the first time and they want to know where to dive in, I feel like you can't really go wrong with exploring the financial district. However, there's a caveat here. Don't just wander around and look at the skyscrapers. Try to figure out, and my book will hopefully help you with this, how the city started there, because the financial district is really where the city began. It's the origin story of the colonial entity that would become New York City. The original Dutch fort called Fort Amsterdam sat right where the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian, the U.S. Custom House, the Alexander Hamilton U.S. Custom House now stands. In front of it is Bowling Green, the first park in the city established in, I think, 1733, where the statue of King George was pulled down after the New Yorkers heard the Declaration of Independence for the first time. If you know what you're looking at, because so much of it's been lost to fire and demolition over the years, that is where New York's story begins, and it really gives you a solid foundation for exploring the rest of the island. If not that, when people ask me what my favorite tour is, if they've already done my Gilded Age tours and they're looking for something else, a surprising tour that I'm so happy I included in this book is Central Park. Because I think standing in Central Park, you have access to so many different pockets of the city. There is a Central Park for Harlem. There's a Central Park for the Upper West Side, both Upper and Lower Upper West Side, Upper and Lower Upper East Side. It touches Midtown. The whole 19th and 20th and into the 21st century version of New York is right at your fingertips in Central Park, which itself has an incredibly deep historical story. Not only stories of things like the College of Mount St. Vincent and Seneca Village, but also stories about how the park came to be, how Frederick Law Olmsted and his partners pulled this park out of the landscape. And so wandering through there, you get to see a different side of New York, one that is not made of brick and steel and asphalt, but is instead made of nature. It is the lungs of the city, and you can appreciate that and then find your exit. If one of the tricks of Olmsted is he wanted to keep you in the park as long as possible. So if you're not lost in one of the woodlands of Central Park, wandering out one of its many gates will take you into a different part of the city, really anywhere you decide to wander. And so then if you get tired of that, walk back into the park and pop out somewhere else. I think it's a really good kind of bingo ball sorting, like a sorting machine, to throw you into the city wherever you feel like being at a certain time.
I'm so glad we included that particular question, because so many people visiting New York always start where they start, Times Square, right? And that's a whole other story. And Times Square didn't even exist until after the beginning of the 20th century.
And it doesn't really exist in my book either.
Well, I know, right? So my last question for you before we open up to everyone is, you've had so many guests come and take your tours, and one of my favorite things to discuss on The Gilded Gentleman are always misconceptions, and we've dealt with a little bit of that tonight. But are there any particular misconceptions about New York in general that people show up and you sort of have to kind of change the prism a little bit about that?
One of the biggest misconceptions, and maybe this is just me, I find such delight in tearing down our idols. And so one of my favorite things, and I try to squeeze this into all of my tours if I can. And if you've been on my tours, you may know where I'm going with this. I love to ruin people's appreciation for brownstone. People are shocked to learn that most brownstone you see in the city today is no longer brownstone, because the stone is so porous and so weak that it has to be, over time, at great expense to the homeowner or the building owner, shaved down and covered with cement and stucco, that they dye to look like the original stone. But it is a terrible building material. which is why it was only used for about a 40-year period. You only really find brownstones from about 1840 to about 1885 or so, with some laggards at the end, usually tenement builders who were using this cheap stone, after it was already out of fashion. But on as many of my tours as I can, I try to find examples of a brownstone building that's never really been repaired, or its repair is cracking. There's one brownstone on 11th Street between 5th and 6th that is currently, it's about to go through restoration, so go find it now, but one of its brownstone steps has actually broken off on the side, so you see the fried Oreo side shot of stucco, cement, rotten brownstone that you can literally rip out with your finger. I didn't tell you to do that. Then more cement, and then more stucco. And so you see this repair job, and you begin to understand that, the whole mythos of brownstone has kind of been built up just since the 1960s, when what the New York Times called urban pioneers, they were just yuppies, began to move to places like Brooklyn Heights and the Upper West Side and fix up these charming houses, which are lovely. But calling them brownstones makes us forget that the stone that was used to build them was used because it was cheap, because it was easy to work with, and we stopped using it because it was awful.
We've certainly myth-busted that. Keith, I love any opportunity I get to talk with you, and I have loved our opportunity tonight, and now it is your turn to talk with Keith.
Could you tell us how you got Anderson Cooper to write your blurb for you?
Is Anderson here? So Anderson found me on social media, super nice guy. But if you don't know, Anderson is like a 7th generation Vanderbilt. A while back, just because this is me being persnickety again, I got really tired of people mourning the loss of the Vanderbilt mansion. And I would say, which Vanderbilt mansion? There were about 15 of them in the city, so pick one. And so that's me being catty, but what I wanted to do was let people know what the Vanderbilts were up to. Where did they live? What did their houses look like? So I did a very exhaustive Instagram story, as I am wont to do, showing you who the Vanderbilts were, each generation from the Commodore down to, I think I went as far as that third generation who built things like the Breakers and Marble House, and just showed who they were, who they married, and what houses they built, at least the ones that I could identify. And somebody must have shared that with Anderson. He started following me, wrote to me, just said, love this. And he just kind of remained like a friendly presence on my social media. And when he wrote his book on the Vanderbilts, sent me a copy. Then he wrote his book on the Astros, sent me a copy. It was just super nice, super supportive. And so when we were in the finishing stages for this book, it was about to go to the printer, I just sent him a DM on Instagram and said, hey, my first book is coming out. It would mean a lot to me if you could, write a little bit. And he agreed, because he's a nice guy.
On your tours, how many people, what's sort of the split between native New Yorkers or people who have lived here for a long time, let's say, and people who are first-time visitors who've just never been here or so? Just curious.
Yeah, the split currently, I haven't done the hard math on this, but as part of my introduction at the start of every tour, I ask where people are from. I would guess about 2/3 are local. Whether they're born and raised here or have lived here long enough that, they're a little sheepish about coming on a tour. The other third come from around the world, and that third ebbs and flows with the seasons. I get a lot more tourists, during, currently it's Semana Santa and Easter week, so I'm getting a lot of visitors this week. And then I get a lot during spring break. I get a lot during August when Europe all goes on vacation at once. And then during the holidays, I also get a lot of visitors. But the rest of the year, especially, thank you, intrepid New Yorkers, for being willing to take tours in 20-degree wet weather. As including the people who've been on both of my recent Broadway walks, which have just been miserably cold and wet, and you've been so nice about it, if any of you are here. But yeah, about 2/3 locals, 1/3 visitors.
Question is, do you have any plans to write any future books, and if so, what topics would you tackle?
So please take this with a massive grain of salt. I just had a very lovely dinner with my publishing executive, she's not here tonight, but Kate, you're not here, right? No. She was over here for a conference, and we had dinner at the Oyster Bar, and over martinis we started talking about what book 2 might look like, and the one idea that for now I am going to try running with and see if it has legs is a book like this, but profiling an exhaustive history and walking suggestions for Manhattan's parks. So I've already done a chapter on Central Park, so that would feature, something like that would feature in a future book. But getting into everything from the Battery to Inwood Hill Park, I think would be a fantastic study. And there's a lot of history there, going all the way back to the native presence in a lot of these parks, why these parks were formed, how many of them have stacks of dead bodies underneath them. I think there's something there that I could chew on, but that's something I'm going to work on for the next couple months.
So you're a historian. You've talked about preservationism and landmarks. Kind of the dark side of that is NIMBYism. There have been a lot of times in the city's history, like Moses tearing down a Penn Station, infrastructure projects, that were the opposite of that. Do you view New York City history as kind of an oscillation between those, or what are the other periods in New York City history where those tensions have been most on display?
That's a good question. One thing that I learned from a professor in grad school, I went to Hunter Urban Planning Program. A professor pointed out the fact that the landmarks preservation movement in the country and really around the world only began after World War II, in part in some places like Europe because they were so devastated, but in places like New York because it was, and this is what stuck with me, it was the first time in really human history that people began to feel that the new buildings going up were inferior to the buildings being torn down for them. That had never happened before. And so I would not say that there's a period prior to like the 50s, 60s era and the rise of the LPC, that there was an era where there was a push and pull. There was a simple understanding that new was better. And in fact, if you look at old news articles talking about the demolition of some really great old landmark that everyone knew and acknowledged was an integral piece of New York City's history, it would be torn down and the article would say this old landmark is going to the wreckers, its site will be improved by blank. And so there was an optimism in newness being better that began to fade after World War II. And so this is a hot take that I avoid sharing on social media because I don't want the deluge of DMs that this would elicit. But I always tell people, as much passion as we have in New York today and emotion that we pour into preservation, I feel like that much also needs to be poured into advocating for better new architecture. Because if we continue to simply preserve, then the city becomes a museum, which it was never really meant to be. And I love our preserved historic neighborhoods. However, we need to be building things today that will be worthy of preservation 200 years from now. And I think for good reason, over the last 60 years or so, we collectively have kind of gotten lost in this mindset that is kind of a topsy-turvy version of what I just said, that improving things, that we are so knee-jerk reaction to new buildings that we don't think of them contextually, we don't think of them critically, we just kind of write off anything new. And so I wish there was more push and pull in that sense. I hope that answered your question, but yeah, we're kind of living through an odd period now that's still in the tail of the Robert Moses demolition Penn Station era.
If you were to be dropped into any era or decade in New York history, which one would you choose besides the Gilded Age?
I don't know what the parameters for the time period I could pick, but if it was like a day, I think I'd be most just curious about the brief window when New York City was the capital. New York, if you don't know, New York City was the capital of the United States from 1785 to 1790. And on the one hand, I just want to, this is a period when there was no photography, art, representations of the period in the buildings there are really kind of limited, kind of it's like very basic watercolor paintings of George Washington taking his oath of office down on Wall Street. I just want to see what the city looked like, and at the time it also would have been rebuilding from being half burned down during the British occupation during the war, and basically none of those buildings still exist today. So I want to see what they looked like. I want to see what the city looked and felt like when it was still a little Dutch, when it was still a little colonial. Morbidly curious what it smelled like. But I think for me, like even as much as I would love to see the Gilded Age just to see the mansions, I've got photos. I kind of have an understanding of what it would have looked like. Pre-photo New York, I would really love to see what it actually looked like because we have so little to go on today.
I was kind of wondering if you could speak to just like your process in terms of researching. There's a lot of old, a lot of old like publications that have like conflicting information. I'm kind of also just curious, like when you know like you're kind of done reading all of these books, like yeah, so just like the process of like kind of how you go about the process of the research and like when you kind of know like I'm done, I can put the book down.
That's a good question. The I'm done part is such a good feeling, and it takes so long to get there. This is why I only post like every other month. The process usually starts with my most obvious sources, which are the kind of blanket resources that you're probably familiar with, like the New York Times archives, which has every newspaper from 1851 to 2002 online if you're a subscriber. Also the Library of Congress's Chronicling America series, which is thousands of newspapers from across the country going back to the 18th century, free and accessible for now. But then there are also things like I pay for an Ancestry.com account so that if I'm drilling down to the story of a person, I can identify where they lived and when, who lived in the house with them. They even get into the interest of like, if it's a wealthy family and they had servants, do I look at 2 back-to-back censuses and see which servants stayed on with them, who were like the loyal, lifelong, maid and butler, and who were, how did the nationalities of the kind of lower staff rungs change over time, and how does that reflect the immigration in these neighborhoods? Like that kind of stuff is what gives meat to a story. It may not end up in my Instagram post or my book or whatever, but it helps me color in the story. I try to follow, once I've got the basic outline of a story, whether it's a biography or a story of a building, I try to just pull every thread that's available to me as far as it'll go, which is what takes my research so long. Recently, if you're on my Patreon, quick plug for that, but I am currently profiling every single person included in Ward McAllister's very messy list of the 400 that he published in 1892. I'm only in the C's after about 2 years of working on it. But most recently, the family that I worked on he was the Chandlers. The guy that I was profiling, he was one of what are called the Astor orphans. And what was supposed to just be a profile of this man and his wife turned into me spending 2 weeks writing profiles that are just sitting in my notes app on my phone about all of his siblings too, because they were equally interesting, but most of them aren't on the list of the 400. So that gets to what you asked about when I'm done. Usually long after I've realized I've strayed off topic. And so I research as much as I can, and this, just organizationally, the best thing I have been doing for the last many years is I organize things in a timeline. So I make a timeline in the Notes app or whatever I'm using, and I hyperlink whatever source it is based on when it's from. And so once that's done, what I find, and maybe this is just how I research, when I look at that timeline, once I feel like it's pretty well fleshed out, the story is there for me. And it becomes obvious what the through line is, what the tale that's going to be told is. And if I feel like I can grab that out of the links, out of the archives, out of the articles, then I'll type it out. And then the hard part is making it enough characters to fit on Instagram. But that's what writing over pictures is for. I add even more nonsense. But anyway, I hope that helped.
So on that same vein, obviously we have a lot of cultural institutions here in the city or perhaps in Rhode Island. Did you use any of the museums for your research? And if not, is there a cultural institution that you could recommend that, that goes along with your book?
That's tough. I'm very much a mole person when I'm researching. So I admit I love many of our historical institutions, like the New York Historical, as they've been rebranded, and the Museum of the City of New York. And I did not use them as a resource as often as maybe I could or should have. I mostly relied on my exhaustive collection of books at home and digital archives. From a just more like personal standpoint, if you haven't visited the Hall of Records and Archives down on Chambers Street in the old the Surrogates Courthouse building, stunning building. Just to have an excuse to go inside is worthy of enough to go visit it there. But they have things like birth certificates, death records, autopsy reports for basically any New Yorker born or died here for well over a century on microfiche, which is just fun to work with. They keep really weird hours. They do a hard close for lunch for like 2 hours in the middle of it. But it's an extraordinary resource that you can go actually like touch and see these things in real time. I've used it more for my own personal genealogical research. Got the autopsy report for my great-great-grandmother who died of gas poisoning on East 50th Street in 1927. But it's all there for you. It's just not digitized. It's very old-fashioned. And it's a really cool resource if you're looking for anything in that specific vein. Anyway, I could talk about research forever.